"Sit down, old man! Now!" The words rang through the courtroom sharper than the gavel. A young attorney's voice carried with smug authority, his finger stabbing the air toward the defendant's table. A ripple of laughter spilled from the gallery, not loud, but cruel enough to echo. Mark Roberts did not move. 73 years old, his frame still carried a trace of military bearing. His right hand rested on a worn manila folder, the corner trembling slightly under the weight of his grip. The label was yellowed with age. Veterans Affairs, Medical Appeal, 1987. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Mark's hearing aid whined for a heartbeat before settling back into a dull hum. He adjusted his stance, one foot half a step behind the other, like a man bracing against a wind invisible to everyone else in the room. Around him, the court shifted with small, cutting gestures, a smirk from the plaintiff's table, a suppressed laugh from the back row. A clerk's hand paused halfway to a water cup before pulling back. No one spoke for him. No one stopped it. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes steady, pencil hovering above his pad but making no mark. His face was unreadable, carved in stillness. Mark looked neither left nor right. His gaze held only on the flag in the corner, its fringe unmoving in the stale air. His jaw tightened once, then stilled. He would not sit. He would not yield. And though the gallery thought the silence was weakness, someone else in that room knew better. Someone else was watching and remembering. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The silence after the laughter felt heavier than the insult itself. Mark Roberts lowered himself slowly into the chair, his knees stiff, the small strain audible to anyone close enough to listen. He did not bow his head. Instead, he set the folder carefully on the table, squared its edges to align with the wood grain, and exhaled through his nose, steady, contained. His hearing aid buzzed again, soft enough to be missed by the gallery, but it made his jaw tighten. He had lived with the sound for half a lifetime, the echo of a blast that had followed him out of the jungles of Vietnam and into every quiet room since. On the cover of the folder, faint impressions of older stamps could still be seen under newer notes. Department of Veterans Affairs, in faded ink. Each page inside had been folded and unfolded more times than the paper was meant to bear. Among them, medical reports from spinal surgeries, letters of denial, records of disability benefits. Tucked neatly in the stack was a copy of his discharge papers, creased but unbent. On top of all this lay a sheet of lined paper with his own careful handwriting. The first line read, simply, "I earned my land." Mark Roberts was 73, a decorated veteran of the United States Army. He had survived the siege of Khe Sanh in 1968, watched the sky burn red over sandbags, and carried more weight on his back than his bones had been meant to hold. His hearing had been broken by mortars, his spine twisted by years of wear, but he stood, and he walked, and he lived alone in a small rented house near the edge of town, still stubborn enough to cut his own grass and fix what broke. The case today was over a shed, a plain wooden structure behind his house where he kept the braces and mobility equipment that allowed him to manage on his own. The shed violated a zoning ordinance updated long after he had built it. The complaint came from a developer looking to buy surrounding lots. For the court, it was a routine hearing. For Mark, it was a matter of principle. He had put on his best suit that morning, the only one left in his closet. The shoulders sagged a little more than they once had, the sleeves brushing low over his wrists. But he buttoned it all the same. His boots, polished to a dull shine, bore faint cracks near the heel. When he had stood at attention in the entryway of the courthouse earlier, no one had noticed. No one had offered him a seat in the waiting area when the benches filled. He had stood anyway. Now he sat in the courtroom, his cane resting across his lap, one hand folded lightly over it. The noise of shuffling papers and quiet whispers around him could have been anywhere, but for Mark, the edges of sound always blurred into memory. He saw young men crouched under ponchos against rain, heard the crack of distant rifles, and yet he kept his focus on the present, on the folded page that reminded him why he was here. This was not a man begging, not a man seeking sympathy. This was a man who still believed that order and law meant something, that fairness was worth showing up for even when the odds tilted against him. He had lived his life by showing up. Today would be no different. The gallery still smirked. The attorneys whispered. The judge's pencil remained still. Mark adjusted the folder once more, drew a breath deep enough to square his shoulders, and waited for what came next. Today, he would be reminded of how easy it is for the world to forget the people who bled for the soil beneath their feet. That morning had begun like so many others, slow and deliberate. Mark had risen before dawn, as he always did, not because he had anywhere urgent to be, but because the habit of early rising had never left him. The light crept pale and soft through the thin curtains of his small rented house. He moved carefully across the worn linoleum floor, each step measured to keep his balance, his cane clacking softly against the tile. His suit jacket hung neatly on the back of a chair, pressed as best he could manage the night before. The cuffs were a touch too long, the shoulders hanging loose where once they had fit snugly across muscle that had since faded. Still, he buttoned it with the precision of a man who believed the way you presented yourself was a reflection of respect. Even if the world had stopped returning it, he would not lower his standards. At the kitchen table, he laid out his papers in order, reviewing them one last time. Medical reports, city notices, the hand-sketched drawing of the shed. He placed his discharge document on top, not because the court had asked for it, but because he knew in his bones that it mattered. A faded photograph slipped from the stack as he adjusted them, himself in uniform, standing beside a helicopter, hair darker, shoulders squared with the weight of youth and war. He looked at it only for a moment, before folding it carefully and tucking it back where it belonged. The walk to the courthouse was 3 blocks, but it might as well have been 3 miles. His right leg dragged slightly, braced by steel that groaned at each step. The cane absorbed the rest, its eagle's head polished from decades of use. As he passed a group of young men clustered near a storefront, one muttered without looking up from his phone, "Guess it's bring a grandparent to court day." Another chuckled, not even bothering to lower his voice. Mark did not break stride. He did not answer. He had learned long ago that not every fight deserved his strength. The courthouse itself was busy, a stream of bodies funneling through metal detectors. The line shifted around him without pause. A woman with a briefcase brushed past his shoulder without apology. When it was his turn, the officer at the checkpoint barked, "Belt off, empty your pockets, let's move." Mark complied without comment, setting his belt, his coins, and the worn pocket watch on the tray. The watch caught the light as it slid through the machine, the lid still etched with initials that had outlived the man they belonged to. The officer glanced at it, uninterested, then waved him forward. Inside, the benches were full. Clerks, attorneys, civilians waiting for their cases. Not one person shifted to make room. Mark remained standing by the wall, one hand on his cane, the other resting lightly on his folder. He looked at the flag near the lobby doors, its folds catching the faint draft of the air system. He did not smile at it. He did not linger with nostalgia. He simply acknowledged it the way a soldier acknowledges another guard on post. A silent nod, then back to his duty. By the time he was called into the courtroom, the small frictions had already built their weight. They did not crush him, but they pressed. They pressed the way rain pressed into clothes. Slow, steady, heavy, until it seemed no one could remember what it felt like to be dry. And yet, even under that weight, Mark carried himself the same way he had always done. Upright, steady, disciplined. No one looked up when he entered the room, not the attorneys gathered at their tables, not the gallery whispering among themselves, not even the bailiff who had seen him waiting in the hall. Mark Roberts walked to his place alone, his cane striking the tile in the steady rhythm of a man who would not allow the world to hear weakness in his step. The attorney leaned forward with the swagger of someone who knew the room would favor him. His voice was loud enough to fill every corner, practiced in the art of dominance. "Your Honor, this man built without a permit," he declared, his tone sharp with disdain. "It is not our job to honor a memoir." The word hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. The gallery chuckled, some hiding their smiles behind hands, others bold enough to laugh openly. To them, it was entertainment, a show of power against someone who could not fight back in the same way. Mark did not flinch. He sat upright, one hand on his cane, the other resting on his folder. His papers were organized in neat stacks, each one a testament to years of patience and appeals. He raised his eyes toward the bench, waiting to be addressed, but the attorney's voice cut across him before he could speak. "Let's be honest," the man sneered. "What's really happening here is that this gentleman thinks his past gives him a free pass to bend the rules. But nostalgia does not exempt you from the law." A whisper rose from the plaintiff's table, just loud enough for others to hear. "If he really served, where's the record?" Another voice chimed in, harsher. "Maybe he thinks he did." The laughter this time was crueler, the kind that bites deep. A young man in the back row muttered something to his companion, and both of them shook their heads with smirks, as though the very idea of Mark's service was nothing more than a story too old to matter. Mark folded his hands more firmly around the cane, the eagle's head pressing into his palm. His breath stayed measured even as his chest tightened. He had faced worse than jeers and suspicion. He had faced fire that seared the sky and ground that shook under shells. But still, something in the words stung, not because he needed recognition, but because of the ease with which strangers dismissed sacrifice. They laughed at what they would never understand, and that laughter spread like a stain across the room. The young court reporter, her fingers poised above the keys, flinched when one of the attorneys raised his voice again. "Do not record his rambling answers unless they're in response to my questions," he barked, then shot a glare in her direction when she hesitated. She lowered her gaze quickly, cheeks coloring, and typed in silence. She had tried, in some small way, to help earlier, but the moment passed, and she withdrew into the safety of neutrality. Mark adjusted the edge of his folder once more, lining it with the table as though that simple act might restore balance to a room that had none. His silence was not weakness. It was armor. He would not give them what they wanted. Anger, outburst, spectacle. He sat, steady and restrained, carrying himself as he always had, with discipline forged in years of hardship. Yet the cruelty around him only grew louder, pressing harder, as though testing how far he could be pushed. The plaintiff's lawyer leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the performance, while whispers buzzed along the benches. The laughter had faded, but its echo still clung to the walls. In that moment, Mark seemed small in the eyes of the room, diminished by their judgment. But the truth was otherwise. He was not broken. He was not defeated. He endured, and endurance is something only the strong can manage. And still, the old soldier did not flinch. Mark sat straighter in his chair, the stiff wood pressing against his spine, the ache familiar, but not unbearable. He lifted his hand from the cane and opened the manila folder, laying its contents across the table with deliberate care. Each document was placed flat, smoothed at the edges, the motion slow, practiced. He had done this 1,000 times before, organizing appeals, lining up medical records, preparing for meetings that rarely ended in justice. His hand lingered briefly on the oldest page, a surgery report marked with smudges of ink where rain had once touched it. The corners curled from years of being pulled out, studied, refolded. He pressed it flat again, as if reminding it that order still mattered. From beneath the papers, he drew out a photograph. It was small, printed decades ago, the colors fading into sepia. In it, a younger Mark stood beside a helicopter, hair damp, eyes sharp, jaw set against exhaustion. Around his neck was a field radio strap, heavy on his shoulders. 2 other men crouched behind him, smiling in a way only soldiers could smile in war, half defiance, half exhaustion. Mark placed the photograph on the table, not showing it to the room, not raising it for effect. He looked at it himself for just a moment, then set it down with quiet finality. When his voice came, it was calm, measured, steady. "I built that shed because I cannot carry groceries up the steps anymore." The Veterans Affairs Office said a ramp request would take 2 years to process, so I built my own answer. He did not raise his tone. He did not argue the ordinance or question the law. He simply explained, with the precision of a soldier giving a report. No bitterness, no plea, just the truth, delivered plainly. The attorney scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes for the benefit of the gallery. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I mean. We are not here to listen to stories from the past. We are here to enforce regulations." The words dripped with mockery, but Mark did not turn his head. He folded the photograph carefully, slid it back into the folder, and aligned the stack of papers once more. His hand trembled slightly as he did it. Whether from age or from the weight of memory, no one could tell. But the gesture was precise, intentional. The silence that followed his statement was different from the earlier hush. This time, it carried weight. The laughter died on its own. The smirks faltered. Even the gallery, restless with whispers a moment ago, sat quieter now, shifting in their seats as if uncertain why the room suddenly felt less safe for mockery. The clerk who had earlier pulled her hand back from offering him water glanced at him again, her lips pressed thin, her eyes softer. Mark leaned back slightly, his palm returning to the eagle-headed cane resting across his lap. He tapped it once against the floor, not loudly, not forcefully, but with the rhythm of a man keeping himself steady. His gaze did not wander. It stayed forward, toward the bench, as though the jeers and dismissals around him were no more than leaves stirring in the wind. This was not surrender. This was not defeat. This was the discipline of a soldier who knew that dignity often lay in silence. Even after decades, even after pain, his composure was unshaken. It was not his medals or his records that proved his service. It was the way he carried himself now, under fire of another kind. And though most in the courtroom had not yet realized it, one man had. At the bench, Judge William Harrow's eyes lingered longer than before, his pencil now set quietly aside. Something in Mark's stillness, his refusal to bow or rage, pulled at a place the judge had not touched in years. The attorney spoke again, but the words seemed thinner now, less sharp, falling into the air without the strength they carried earlier. Mark had not raised his voice. He had not defended himself with anger, but the room had shifted, quietly, imperceptibly to most. His silence spoke louder than any rebuttal could. And across the bench, another uniform from another war was beginning to take notice. The courtroom buzzed faintly after Mark's calm explanation, but the tone had changed. The gallery's whispers no longer carried the sharpness of mockery. They were muted, uncertain, like echoes that dared not rise above the weight that had settled over the room. The attorney tried to push his advantage, rifling through his notes with exaggerated confidence, but his voice landed thinner now, each word bouncing off a silence that did not bend as easily as before. He glanced at the judge, expecting the same nod of support he had always received, but the judge did not nod. He did not even look at him. Judge William Harrow sat perfectly still, his robe heavy across his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the man at the defendant's table. His hands were steepled in front of him, fingers pressed together, unmoving. He did not tap his gavel. He did not write. He simply watched. His gaze lingered not on the documents spread across the table, but on the way Mark Roberts sat. The posture, the restraint, the silence. It was not the silence of confusion or defeat. It was the silence of someone who had stood under fire before and learned the discipline of holding steady when others could not. For a moment, the judge's eyes flicked toward the flag in the corner. Its fabric caught a faint breath of air from the vent above, the fringe trembling almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. To most, it was nothing more than a courtroom decoration, one more symbol in a room of legal process. But to him, it was memory. It was the weight of days when men his age had been told to hold a perimeter with nothing but grit and the knowledge that failure was not an option. The pencil that had rested between his fingers slipped quietly onto the desk. He set it down deliberately, no longer interested in feigning the appearance of routine. The gallery did not notice the gesture, but Mark did. He caught the movement from the corner of his eye, the way a soldier catches small shifts in the environment without turning his head. For the first time since entering the room, he felt less alone. The attorney continued his argument, his words sharper now as though trying to reclaim dominance. "Your Honor, this man cannot simply bend the law to his personal convenience. He is wasting this court's time. These stories, these papers, irrelevant." His tone rose with impatience, and the gallery shifted, sensing the tension swell. But still, Judge Harrow said nothing. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the fabric of his robe pulling taut, his hands now resting open on the desk as though laying down unseen weapons. His gaze never left Mark. There was a weight behind his stillness, the kind that made even silence feel loud. The bailiff noticed it and shifted uncomfortably by the wall, unsure why the room suddenly felt heavier. The clerk glanced nervously at the judge and then back at her notes, her hand pausing mid-scribble. Even the court reporter hesitated, her keys suspended above the machine, waiting. Mark did not speak again. He did not need to. He sat exactly as he had, upright, quiet, his folder aligned with the grain of the table. But across the space between them, Judge Harrow saw something no one else did. He saw the same steel he had once known in men who stood their ground in places far from here, in jungles and skies where silence had been survival and composure had been the difference between life and chaos. The attorney laughed once, short and dismissive, trying to pull the room back under his control. But the sound fell flat, dying in the heavy air. No one joined him. Not this time. Judge Harrow drew in a slow breath, the kind that steadied more than lungs. He had not planned to intervene. He had not planned to reveal anything beyond the ruling he was required to give. But the insult had gone too far, and the dignity at the defendant's table had struck too deep a chord to ignore. The judge leaned forward once more, his voice still unspoken, his intent not yet revealed. But in the silence between them, the shift had already begun. The attorney's voice grew bolder, as if filling the space with sheer volume could drown out the weight that had crept into the room. He pointed across the aisle, his hand cutting through the air like a blade. "This is not about the past, Your Honor. This is about zoning codes and ordinances. The defendant cannot simply claim hardship and bypass the law. If every citizen did that, we would have no order at all. This man's service, if it even happened, is irrelevant." The words landed sharp, meant to wound, meant to seal the case with finality. A ripple passed through the gallery, an uneasy mix of nods, murmurs, and the faint sound of someone stifling a laugh. The court reporter glanced up again, her eyes darting toward the bench, her fingers trembling above the keys. The bailiff shifted his weight, jaw clenched but silent. Even those who had laughed earlier now seemed unsettled, though they did not yet understand why. Mark Roberts did not react. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded loosely over the eagle-headed cane across his lap. His folder rested neatly before him, his papers aligned, his silence unbroken. He had nothing to add, nothing to defend, nothing to prove. The strength in him was not in argument, but in stillness. Judge William Harrow let the silence stretch after the attorney's final words, so long that the air itself seemed to grow taut. Then, with a voice that cut through the tension like a steady drumbeat, he spoke. "Mr. Roberts, would you approach the bench?" The attorney blinked, confused. The gallery stilled. Mark lifted his head slowly, his brow furrowing in quiet surprise. He hesitated only a moment before placing one palm on the table, pushing himself to his feet. His cane tapped once against the tile as he rose. The room was silent now, so silent that the sound of that single tap echoed like a gavel strike. He steadied himself and began the slow, deliberate walk forward, each step a reminder of battles long past and wounds carried ever since. At the bench, he stopped. His eyes met the judge's, searching for instruction. Judge Harrow's face remained stern, unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, an intensity that made the air heavier still. Then, without a word, the judge reached to his chest. His hands grasped the edges of his robe and, with a deliberate motion, he slipped it from his shoulders. The black fabric folded down into his arms, heavy, solemn, and he placed it gently across the desk before him. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The gallery shifted as though leaning forward together, their laughter long gone, replaced by a stunned stillness. The attorneys froze, their mouths half open, their confidence crumbling in the face of an act no one expected. Judge Harrow stepped down from the dais. His shoes struck the wood softly, one step, then another, until he stood directly in front of Mark Roberts at eye level. The judge's back was straight, his expression solemn, his hands at his sides. For a heartbeat, the entire room held its breath. Then he raised his right hand to his brow and delivered a crisp salute. Mark's chest tightened. He had not been saluted in decades. Not like this, not from one who understood. His eyes glistened faintly, but his body obeyed instinct. He straightened his shoulders, steadied his hand, and returned the salute with perfect form, as if all the years between now and his last command had vanished. His cane leaned against the rail, forgotten in that moment. His hand trembled, but his salute did not falter. The courtroom was utterly silent. No whispers, no laughter, no sound, but the quiet rustle of fabric as both men lowered their hands. The weight of that gesture lingered like a flag in still air, undeniable, unshakable. Judge Harrow did not speak immediately. He simply stood before Mark, the robe set aside, his salute returned, his silence speaking louder than any ruling could. Then, with quiet authority, his voice finally carried, "This man's service is not irrelevant. It is the reason we are able to sit in this room at all." The gallery sat frozen, every pair of eyes fixed on the two men before them. The courtroom had changed in that moment. Its walls held more than law. They now held memory, sacrifice, and recognition. And in the silence that followed, the room itself seemed to breathe differently, as though it too understood the weight of what had just occurred. The salute hung in the air even after both hands had lowered, like the echo of a bell long after its strike. The silence in the courtroom was not the fragile quiet that comes before laughter, nor the impatient hush of people waiting for proceedings to continue. It was deeper, heavier, as though the room itself understood it had witnessed something sacred. Mark Roberts stood facing the judge, his chest rising slowly, his cane forgotten against the rail. The lines of his face carried years of endurance, but for the first time in that courtroom, he did not appear small. He looked every bit the soldier he had once been. Judge William Harrow remained before him, the black robe folded neatly on the bench, his own expression solemn but softened by memory. The corners of his eyes were damp, though no tear fell. He had seen many men in this courtroom, defendants, plaintiffs, lawyers eager to win at any cost, but in this moment, all those roles faded. What he saw before him was not a zoning case, not a technical violation, but a man who had once carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Their eyes met, steady, locked in a silence that did not require words. In that gaze was a recognition only those who had worn the uniform could truly share, the knowledge of what it meant to stand watch in the dark, to lose comrades whose names still burned in memory, to return home carrying scars the world never saw. It was the unspoken language of brotherhood, spoken without lips, carried in the steel of posture and the tremor of breath. The gallery shifted uneasily. A young man near the back lowered his phone, realizing instinctively that recording what had just happened would cheapen it. A woman pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on the older man at the defense table. Even the opposing attorney, who had moments earlier been brimming with arrogance, sat rigid, his confidence broken, his gaze fixed firmly on his papers as though unable to meet the sight before him. Judge Harrow bent down for a moment, retrieving a single sheet of paper that had slipped from Mark's folder in the shuffle. He straightened its edges with the same precision Mark himself had shown, then placed it back gently on the stack. He did not announce it. He did not make a show. He simply restored what had fallen, an act so small that it carried more dignity than any speech could. The clerk near the side table adjusted her chair, her throat tight. She had been in this courtroom for years, had seen countless hearings blur together. But she knew she would remember this day when all others faded. The bailiff, a man who rarely let his face betray emotion, shifted his stance and straightened his back unconsciously, as though reminded of what posture once meant. Mark inhaled deeply, his hand resting lightly on the folder once more. His voice did not rise, but when he spoke, it carried through the silence like a clear note. I do not ask for honor. I only ask for fairness. The words were plain, but their weight sank into every ear. He did not look at the gallery, nor at the attorney who had mocked him. His eyes remained on the judge, the man who had saluted him as an equal. Judge Harrow nodded once, a movement so subtle yet so heavy with meaning that it seemed to close a circle left open for decades. Then, turning slightly, he faced the gallery. His voice was low but carried, steady and unmistakable. He does not need this court to confirm his service. I was there. Different branch. Same war. The shift in the room was undeniable. Those who had laughed sat motionless, their smirks long gone. Even the air seemed to have stilled, heavy with the understanding that they were no longer spectators to a legal proceeding, but witnesses to something greater, a quiet honoring of sacrifice, a brotherhood that transcended the years, a truth that could not be argued away. And for the first time since the case began, the weight of mockery in the room dissolved, replaced by a silence that held respect, awe, and the faintest trace of shame. The judge's words lingered in the silence. Different branch. Same war. The gallery held still, some shifting in discomfort, others frozen in awe. The younger attorney who had mocked Mark Roberts stared down at his legal pad as though the lines of ink might swallow him whole. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier felt obscene now, echoing faintly in memory, impossible to imagine rising again. Judge William Harrow's gaze remained fixed on Mark. He studied him not as a defendant, not as a man accused of a technical violation, but as a fellow soldier who had walked through the same smoke-filled years. His voice came quiet, stripped of formality, carrying the weight of memory rather than authority. Tell me, he said, what did the ground smell like after the shells fell? A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some frowned, confused. Others tilted their heads, trying to make sense of the strange, almost poetic question. But Mark understood instantly. His jaw tightened. His eyes, clear but tired, looked past the courtroom, past the wood-paneled walls, and into the red earth of another country. He drew in a slow breath through his nose, then answered with words that were almost a whisper, yet strong enough to carry. Clay, he said, like rust, steam rising off torn earth. The room went silent again, the kind of silence that seemed to sink into the bones of everyone present. Judge Harrow's eyes closed briefly, then opened, his lips pressing into a line. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming a memory long buried. His voice, steadier now, came again. I remember. He leaned closer, his words dropping to a tone not meant for performance, but for recognition. You were with the 3rd Battalion Marines. Khe-san. The statement was not a guess. It was spoken like a truth pulled from the earth itself. Mark's answer was simple, unembellished. Yes. He did not recount stories. He did not explain battles. He did not describe medals or wounds. He gave nothing more than acknowledgement, because acknowledgement was all that was needed between men who had lived it. The judge's throat tightened, and for a moment his voice betrayed the weight of years. I read your name once, on a casualty list. Thought you didn't make it. Mark's hand pressed against the folder before him, the veins on his skin raised beneath the strain. His reply was steady, not sorrowful, not boastful. I made it, but parts of me never left. The words landed heavy, like stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading across the room. A younger man in the gallery, barely out of his 20s, sat straighter. His cap, which had been tilted carelessly on his head, he now removed, folding it nervously in his hands. The clerk at the side table blinked rapidly, her eyes damp, though she tried to keep her expression professional. Even the bailiff, seasoned and stern, swallowed once and looked toward the flag as though finding something there to steady himself. Judge Harrow's voice softened, his gaze locked on Mark. Whiskey Echo 6. The words were quiet, coded, but they carried the kind of familiarity that no civilian ear could grasp. That was the call sign. I never forgot it. Mark's eyes lifted, his voice coming low but firm. I carried your friend. 3 miles through fire. He bled out before the medevac came. His words were not dramatic, not intended to stir pity. They were plain, like a battlefield report, brutal in their simplicity. The judge inhaled sharply, his composure steady, but his eyes glossed with the memory of a man he once knew, a man whose life and death had been bound to the one standing before him. You saved him, Harrow said quietly. Even if he didn't make it, you gave him the chance to be carried home. I never forgot that. The gallery had grown utterly still, every laugh now soured into shame, every whisper silenced. The attorneys sat with their shoulders tense, their arguments stripped away by truths deeper than law. For years, Mark Roberts had been dismissed, doubted, ignored. But now, in the center of a courtroom, with all eyes upon him, the truth of his sacrifice was laid bare, not by himself, not by appeals, but by another man who had lived enough of the same war to know. And the men who had mocked him could not look away. Judge William Harrow stood at the center of the courtroom floor, his robe folded neatly on the bench behind him, his gaze fixed firmly on the gallery. His voice came low at first, but it carried with the weight of a man who had spoken orders before. Words that meant the difference between life and death. This man's service is not irrelevant, he said, each syllable deliberate. It is the very reason we are able to sit in this room, under law, in peace. The gallery, once restless with laughter and murmurs, was motionless now. A few leaned forward, unable to look away. Others sat rigid, their eyes lowered in shame. The attorney who had mocked Mark earlier cleared his throat as if to interject, but when the judge's eyes flicked toward him, cold, sharp, and unwavering, his words shrank back into silence. The arrogance drained from him like air from a punctured tire. Turning back toward the bench, Judge Harrow resumed his place with slow, measured steps. He did not put his robe back on. Instead, he rested both hands flat on the wood, the posture less that of an official issuing orders and more of a man placing his weight on the truth. This court finds, he continued, his voice steady, that the ordinance in question was improperly applied in this case. The charges against Mr. Roberts are dismissed. The words rang with finality, but he did not stop there. He lifted his gaze toward the clerk's desk, then the bailiff, then the gallery as a whole. Furthermore, he said, from this day forward, accommodations for disabled veterans will not be delayed, denied, or dismissed by red tape. This court recommends immediate exemption for necessary structures and access modifications when they serve the dignity and independence of those who carried the burden of service. The clerk's pen, poised above her notes, shook slightly as she recorded the words, knowing instinctively that this was not just routine procedure, but a precedent being set in the very air around her. The bailiff shifted his stance, his eyes steady now, his shoulders squared in quiet agreement. The court reporter's fingers moved swiftly, recording each syllable with reverence, aware that the transcript itself was history. The judge's voice softened then, but it did not lose its power. He turned directly to Mark, his tone no longer official, but deeply personal. Mr. Roberts, he said, this city owes you more than a ruling. It owes you space to stand, with dignity, and that will be remembered here. Mark sat silently, his eyes lowering for just a moment before lifting again. His grip tightened slightly on the eagle-headed cane, the weight of decades pressing against the simplicity of the moment. He gave a single nod, not in gratitude, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Soldier to soldier, man to man. A small movement broke the silence. In the gallery, a boy no older than 10 stood on the bench beside his mother. His small hand rose slowly to his brow in a salute, clumsy but sincere. His mother tugged at his sleeve, but the boy held the gesture. Across the aisle, Mark noticed him and returned the salute with the same steady precision he had given the judge. The boy's eyes widened, and he lowered his hand reverently, his face serious in a way that children rarely carry. The courtroom did not erupt. There was no applause, no cheers, no outpouring of sound. Instead, there was stillness, thick, unshakable, reverent. It was the kind of silence that did not demand recognition but gave it freely. A silence that carried more respect than words ever could. And in that silence, something shifted permanently. The laughter that had once filled the room would never echo in those walls the same way again. A week later, the courthouse looked much the same from the outside. The same stone steps, the same line of people filing in with papers tucked under arms, the same weary shuffle of daily business. Yet inside, something felt different, though no one would have been able to explain it in words. The gallery benches seemed to hold a new stillness. The flag in the corner seemed to stand taller. Even the echo of footsteps on the tile seemed less hurried, as if the building itself remembered what had taken place there. Mark Roberts walked the same path he had a week earlier. His cane tapped against the steps as he ascended slowly, his free hand gripping the rail. This time, no one brushed past him with impatience. A man waiting near the doors held them open without being asked. Mark nodded once, a silent thank you, and stepped inside. His suit was the same navy one, pressed as best he could manage, but he wore it differently now, less like armor, more like acknowledgement of the occasion. He was not here as a defendant today. He had been invited. A handful of new clerks sat at long tables inside a training room adjacent to the court. They listened as senior staff explained protocols, flipping through binders and scribbling notes. Among them was a new line added to procedure. Veterans and disabled citizens will be accommodated without delay. Assistance shall be offered before it is requested. The words were simple, printed in black ink, but their meaning was profound. Mark stood at the front briefly, at the request of Judge Harrow. He did not lecture. He did not recount the details of his case. He simply told the clerks, in his quiet voice, what it meant to wait, year after year, for dignity to be restored by policy. He ended with one sentence. Respect should not have to be asked for. Then he gathered his papers, gave a small nod, and stepped aside. His presence lingered longer than his words. At the back of the room, Judge William Harrow watched in civilian clothes. No robe, no bench, no gavel. Just a man among men, his hands folded before him, his eyes carrying the weight of memory. He did not interrupt. He did not step forward. He simply bore witness, as he had once done in another life, on another soil. When Mark passed him at the door, the judge inclined his head slightly, and Mark returned the gesture. No words were needed. Outside, the sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, warming the stone. Mark paused at the base, adjusting the strap of his folder beneath his arm. A young clerk hurried after him, her voice uncertain but sincere. "Sir," she said, "you changed how I see things. I won't forget it." Mark studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then gave a single nod. That was enough. Near the entrance, a small plaque had been mounted during the week. It was not ornate, not gilded, not set high on a wall. It stood at eye level, simple black letters on brushed steel. Honor is not granted. It is remembered. In recognition of Mark Roberts, United States Army. People passed it without ceremony, but more than one slowed, reading the words with quiet respect before moving on. Mark stepped into the morning light, his cane tapping against the pavement, his figure small against the wide expanse of the courthouse facade. Yet in that smallness was something unshakable. He had not sought applause, and none had come. He had not demanded recognition, but it had been given. And though the city bustled on, though traffic roared and voices rose in the street, within those walls his story had been written into the fabric of the place. He did not smile. He did not weep. He simply walked forward as he always had, steady, disciplined, carrying both the weight of memory and the quiet relief of respect restored. The wars he had fought were long behind him, but their echoes still shaped his steps. And now, in this city, in this courtroom, those steps would no longer be taken unseen. Some wars do not end on the battlefield. Some wars end in the silence of a courtroom, where dignity must be defended all over again. But when the right man stands, even in stillness, honor is remembered. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.